So here is Mr. Random. He says 5.2 dead per million worldwide. Hardly the end of the world. I like my chances. Yeah, that seems to me a somewhat selfish attitude. It does seem to me that one of the things that this crisis is very much teaching us is the importance to us of each other and the importance of taking care of those who are most vulnerable, especially the elderly and those with prior medical conditions. But I would also urge you to consider, Mr. Random, the things I've been saying which go beyond that. There is a real risk in this situation that we get a kind of contagion, to coin a phrase. There is a real risk in this situation that we end up having much wider ramifications than the number who have been suffering and dying. So here's the most obvious such risk, and this has been encountered already in Italy. Excuse me, this is a technical call. Hello, Max. Okay. Max has gone. Sorry about this. I think that was Max, who was my technical assistant, calling in relation to the stream having disconnected. Yeah. Okay, Max again. Hi, Max. Is this working? Can you see us? Yeah, I'm live. Yeah. So it stopped and then I started again. Yeah. Cheers. Sorry about that, everybody. As I say, this is an experiment that we're doing here. We've never done this kind of live streaming before, so bear with us in the technical hitches. We're all learning how to do this kind of thing. Yeah, I was getting to the point about what's happened in Italy, which is that basically their healthcare system, their whole system, is on the verge of collapse in North Italy. And that's because the hospitals have all been overwhelmed. And what that means, of course, is that if you have another problem, if you were to have a heart attack or a car accident or somebody beat you up or whatever it is, right, then you're not going to get the medical care that you need. And countries which don't have working healthcare systems, modern countries that don't have working healthcare systems, are highly dangerous places, to put it mildly, to be. So it's not just about the direct effects of the coronavirus, it's also about the knock-on effects. And we can see the same situation in many other contexts. Consider, for example, the floods in Lancaster, in northern England a few years ago. People often think, well, flooding, well, that's not really going to affect me. I don't live on a floodplain. I'm not near a river. So what happened in the floods in Lancaster a few years ago? So about, I think about 100 houses or something were flooded out, but also the electricity substation was flooded out. And so the electricity went down across the whole of Lancaster. And that meant things like a lot of people couldn't get in or out of their houses. It meant that virtually no telephones worked. The whole of Lancaster got into some quite serious problems for several days because of the flooding, not just the places near the river. So those kinds of climate-influenced, climate-chaotic events, which again, tragically, we're going to see more and more of in the years to come, don't just think about their direct effects. Think about their indirect knock-on effects. That's where you get the potentiality for a broader harm. That's where you get the potentiality for disasters. Now, Lizzie says, this is an opportunity for the paradigm shift we need. Returning to business as usual will compound the disaster trajectory. Where is the blue sky thinking? Who is looking ahead 5 months, let alone 5 years? XR has a vital role here. Let's all think beyond the virus. Yeah, totally agree. But as I say, there are important questions of timing here. We can think way ahead. We should be engaging in blue skies thinking right now. But now is not the time to come forth saying things like, what we need right now is a Green New Deal, because we don't need a Green New Deal right now. What we need right now is for most people to stay at home, and we need people to be making ventilators, and we need people to be making personal protective equipment, and we need people to be caring and doing mutual aid and stuff like that. And let's let's use this let's kind of be in this crisis and be in this emergency and experience it for itself and see how that changes us. I've already hinted one or two things that I think that might change in that regard. I think that when we come to see ourselves and feel ourselves as more vulnerable, that changes a lot of things, and that feeds into the kind of awareness we need also around other potential existential threats, such as climate. I think that when we get to experience all of us together at the same time, the risk of those who are older than us being worse off than us, and the likelihood that some of them will die, that changes us, and we learn something new about what matters to us and what's important. So yeah, absolutely, as you say, Lizzie, let's think beyond the virus. Make sure we don't get obsessed in kind of relatively short-term thinking. Like I say, we've got to think about these different timetables with the virus, a matter of weeks, with climate and ecology, generally a matter of years. But let's make sure that we don't shortcut the process and don't sort of try to rush to the point where we can be clear about how we want to remake the world. Yeah, absolutely, you're completely right. We need to remake the world completely differently as we come out of this. And that's why I was saying, for example, we should not simply restart business as usual in the skies. We should not restart business as usual in terms of mining and construction and fossil fuel burning and so on and so forth. But how exactly we go into that different future, how we rebuild our house differently. If your house burns down, you don't unthinkingly rebuild it exactly the same way. Right now, it's as if our house is burnt down. Let's rebuild it much more intelligently. But let's stay where we are right now. Let's focus immediately on stopping the crap stuff that they want to do, which would start to recommit us to a rubbish business as usual future. Let's see what we can learn from this time of vulnerability and crisis and emergency. And then let's be ready, as this COVID crisis starts to diminish, let's be ready to demand and to build the better world that you're quite rightly calling for. So thanks for that. Okay, so here's an interesting one from NM. Does this crisis show that governments can't deal with a crisis? They just copy what others have done rather than coming up with independent strategy, e.g. community response in small democratic units. Well, interesting. Yes and no. I think this crisis does show that governments can't deal with a crisis if they try to deal with it in ways that they're used to dealing with other things in. So what did this crisis demand? This crisis demanded incredibly rapid, precautionary, preemptive action. And that's what I was arguing for and what Nassim Taleb and others have been arguing for. And we mostly didn't get that. We did get it after a while in China. We did get it after a while in South Korea. It's interesting that it seems to be the East Asian countries which have actually done best in this crisis. One possible explanation for why that is that they actually learned from the SARS epidemic a decade ago, which was basically restricted to their countries. But actually, you say, NM, the problem is that governments just copy what others have done rather than coming up with independent strategy. Well, but the problem that we've had in Britain is that we haven't copied others enough, right? We should have been copying some aspects of what China's done. We should have been copying quite a lot of what South Korea's done. We should have been copying some of what Germany's done. Instead, it seems as though what happened is that the nudge psychologists at number 10 Downing Street and Dominic Cummings came up with an idea which they thought was oh so clever, of going completely against the main established scientific consensus, going completely against the World Health Organization, and just allowing most of us to be infected with COVID-19. So I think that there's a balance to be struck here. Yeah, you need to act in original ways and rapid ways when you're facing a potential new unprecedented crisis. But you also need to copy best practice, and you need to be coordinated and joined up. The World Health Organization strategy works if it's a joined up strategy around the world. Now, I like your last point. We should have community response in small democratic units. Yeah, absolutely. I think that the crisis shows how governments such as the UK government have not been fleet of foot And as John Ashton has argued, another person worth following on Twitter about this whole crisis, as John Ashton has argued, it probably would have been better if there had been more decentralization in this country, more localization, to enable communities to protect themselves and to look after themselves. XR is looking to contribute in some of that on the ground, right? People are doing quite a lot of mutual aid and so on the ground. It would have been great if governments had empowered and enabled that more. That could have been a great source of helpfulness. Some very nice comments in the chat about me. Thank you for those. Really appreciate them. Okay, so here's another one. Robin Crow, this is interesting. We do not want to go back to normal, which is of course not normal at all. And that is very well said, right? One of the things which this crisis does is it raises the question of what does normal even mean? Now, if all that normal means is what you're used to, then fine, you could try and go back to that. But does that really make any sense at all? Is it normal to have a society that is premised upon killing billions of other beings every year? Is it normal to have a society which is sowing the seeds completely predictably of its own destruction? Is it normal to have a society which, as I said earlier, cannot question the institution of mass air travel? Seems just congenitally unable to question it. No, there's a good argument for saying none of those things should be considered normal. So yeah, let's not go back to them. In the future, we need to be able to ask what's been hitherto unaskable. What level of air travel is compatible with the kind of levels of risk that are compatible with being civilized and intelligent? And I would argue that the level is obviously far less than we have. That our world needs to be, to a significant extent, in terms of physical interconnectivity, deglobalized. That would make us safer from future pandemics. It would make us safer from the climate emergency. Okay. What else we got here? Yeah. Yes, this is another one from Random, which I like very much. No one should be bailed out except the people. When they talk about bailouts, when they say, yeah, our business empire is tottering, we need your money to support us now. And by they, I mean things like the airlines, things like the fossil fuel companies, but there are others as well, of course. What we should say in response is a few things. First thing we should say is, well, look, it's very unreasonable for you to ask for that kind of money now, given that you didn't put money away to keep yourself safe in the good times. Yeah, we saw this extraordinary thing of EasyJet paying out massive dividends. I think it was just last week, that's it's just crazy at a time like this, when obviously what they ought to be doing is trying to, if they're serious about saving their business, is to put everything they've got into saving their business. It's not good enough for businesses to come to the state to bail them out, but not in the good times to try to make it less necessary for them to come to the state if there are bad times. But more specifically, the people who need bailing out are us, are the people. And in particular, for example, in the UK, people on 0 hours contracts still not being adequately treated, even though the government has come up with quite bold measures, as I said earlier, for economic amelioration. People on 0 hours contracts are still in a very difficult position. There's still a lot of people who are falling through the cracks. It would have been much easier if the government had instituted a citizen's income or a universal basic income. And again, that's the kind of policy which seemed so radical and so sort of impossible to the mainstream just a month ago, but now starts to seem like common sense. The people should be bailed out, not the corporations. Couldn't agree more. Yeah, here's another nice example from Rinin. The fracking industry is totally propped up by governments and speculators. Let them fail. By the way, there is good reason to believe that quite a lot of frackers in the United States are going to fail during this crisis, which again could be a good thing, a really good thing. They're going to fail because they're on the borderline of profitability anyway. It doesn't take much to push them under. So in that sense, the creative destruction of capitalism can be a good thing at a time like this. Here's an interesting one. NM again says, the youngsters are not affected by the virus. Is this another case of not considering the future and lives of the younger generation? I'm not quite sure what you mean by the question there, but let me just clarify a little bit. Firstly, it's true to say that youngsters are sometimes affected by the virus. As I said, someone who's 19 years old with no prior medical conditions died today in the UK. Secondly, obviously, one's hope is that youngsters will be concerned about those who are older than them, their parents, their grandparents, etc., etc. And I think they will. I think, tragically, this sense of concern will grow in the coming weeks as the mortality figures grow. Basically, by the end of this pandemic, if it has an end, we're all going to know someone who's died, and no one will feel immune. And in that way, it's very much an experience of shared mortality, at least by proxy. Then remember that, as I said before, you've got the risk of health service breakdown, which potentially affects everybody. But finally, here's an interesting point, which I think could be really, really important. And this goes back to the kind of thing that Lizzie was saying earlier. Really, really important as we start to come out of this. It is true to say that those who are at most risk in this epidemic are the old. And so hopefully what's going to happen in the coming weeks and months is that through our health service, through mutual aid, and in numerous ways, we're going to try together to save the lives of our old people. And hopefully, when we've done that, to the extent that we succeed in doing it, we'll then start to think more about future possible crises, which may affect different groups. And the obvious example is the climate and ecological emergency, which disproportionately affects the young, because the young are going to be the ones who are still going to be alive when our world deteriorates climatically and ecologically, as will happen to some extent, definitely, and as will happen in a terrible way if we don't arrest it in the kind of way that Extinction Rebellion are seeking to arrest it. So you see the way that this kind of works. There's a great potential here, it seems to me, and this is a real hope that might come from this dark time of Corona. There's a great potential for a sort of new international and intergenerational solidarity. An intergenerational solidarity between the old who are vulnerable in this crisis and the young who are vulnerable in the next longer crisis. And maybe if we save as many of the old as we can, and that's what we've got to do right now, maybe some of them will have a different perspective after that on saving the young. And in this dark time, that is, I think, an encouraging thought. Okay, Random says, very smart guy, but shit, slow down. How much coffee have you had? So I don't drink caffeine. But just to let you know, I had never done any of these kind of live stream things before a week ago, before with this lockdown started. I think we're all learning how to do it. So I will take the advice and try and slow down a little. Right, what else we got here? Okay, different kind of question, but I'm happy to take questions on whatever. Artifacting Reality says, why doesn't XR address the aerosol masking effect, aka global dimming? So this might be a bit techie for some of you, but it's actually very important. The basic situation of global dimming is that there's a lot of pollution in the atmosphere, and that masks, those aerosols mask some of the effect of global overheating. So there is a worry that if we reduce the pollution levels, which obviously we want to do and need to do for a billion reasons, then that may lead to a spike in global heating, which could be very damaging. And we saw a small example of that in 2001 when airplanes were grounded after the attack on the World Trade Center. And we saw some of that recently during the early stages of Corona, especially in China, where air pollution dramatically dropped. So the answer to the question is that XR does address global dimming, and we're certainly concerned about it. We don't think it's a good reason to stop air pollution, not at all. But we do think that you need to exercise caution in how you move to clean up the world, and not. If we did literally stop all carbon emissions overnight, that would potentially be dangerous in terms of the immediate spike in global temperatures. But basically, the fundamentals of the situation is that we need to bring down air pollution for the sake of life and health and so on. And we need to bring down carbon pollution for reasons that you're all, I'm sure, familiar with. And we can do these together, and the reality is that they mostly won't happen overnight. It'll take years. The XR argument is that it should take, in countries like the UK, about 5 years, and the rest of the world about 10 years. And that's a timetable that is perfectly viable with not having a sudden massive spike in temperature. But there will be probably one of the things which is important to know about the aerosol masking effect is that it is probable that the total amount of global overheat in the system is more than we generally realize, and certainly more than we generally experience, because some of that heat effect is being masked. That, of course, just makes it all the more urgent and crucial to reduce carbon emissions rapidly and make sure that we don't blow our small remaining carbon budget. Right. What else we got here? Okay, yeah. Yes, David Holloway from Facebook says, "We would not help by taking to the streets at this time. It would be great if tech and social experts could coordinate mass social media actions against fossil fuel funders and industry. Barclays has an AGM in May and could decide to stop its funding of fossil fuels. And Barclays has made a few good moves in recent days, tentative small moves in the right direction." Basically, I agree with you. And that is the way that Extinction Rebellion are heading right now. We're still doing some things out there. So, for example, stopping HS2, it's not exactly the streets, right? It's people in trees. And you can do that, social distancing, and you can do that without large numbers. So I think it's brilliant, the heroic anti-HS2 activism that's happening right now. But yeah, it would be, I think, a foolish mistake and a diversion for XR to get on the streets, literally, in large numbers right now. So yeah, that's why I was saying earlier, let's get smarter at digital activism and so on again, and XR will be coordinating some stuff around that, especially probably, as you say, in relation to money. Right. What else we got? Yeah, this is a good one from Kathy. "During the war, people grew a lot of their own food in their back gardens. Maybe it's time to ditch the lawns and grow our own food instead." Well, yeah. Not to scaremonger, but there is a very real chance that there will be food shortages in this country or other countries this year if we get the kind of combination of bad luck I described earlier. That means various things, but one of the things it means is, yeah, absolutely. Especially if right now you're locked down at home, there's nothing that makes more sense than doing some planting and making a little bit of an impact on the food needs that your own household will have, and getting a little bit of practice for the future and so on as well. Students at university where I teach sometimes ask me, for careers advice, and I say various things. But one of the things I say is, good idea to learn how to grow food. That could be useful for anybody in the years to come. And this year, it could be very useful right now. So Jeffrey Mayer says, "Wrapping the pandemic situation into some sort of anti-carbon rant is a clear sign of anti-carbon fundamentalism. The preoccupation with reducing CO2 is a dodgy ideology." So I'm not sure where you're coming from there, Jeffrey. If you're coming from a perspective of climate change denial, then all I can really say to you is I'm sorry for you. But if you're coming at it from the perspective of saying, look, we need to be cautious about not moving too quickly, as it were, from the corona situation to the climate situation, well, then I agree with you. And that's what I said earlier in answer to Lizzie Jensen's question, that I think it's important to experience this crisis as it is right now, as it unfolds in the immediacy of it, and not assume that the way that we've been thinking before continues to apply, at least not directly in the same way. I think it would be a foolish error for Extinction Rebellion, for example, right now to leave its demands completely unchanged over the coming months. And I'm working with others in Extinction Rebellion to look at modifying our demands to reflect the new reality and to emphasize more, for example, the need to have an economy based on well-being, an economy within planetary limits, an economy that accomplishes a just transition. That's more important than ever because of the economic stress and strain that the country is in. Okay. Kathy Barley says, subsidies need to be moved away from animal agriculture and more towards sustainable, self-sufficient food sources. Yeah, that's obvious, right? So when we're in a situation that we're in right now, where we have the real risk of food shortages emerging, it makes very little sense to be putting so much of our resources into animal agriculture. A really good resource here is George Monbiot's film Apocalypse Cow, which is worth a watch. Let's go towards the more recent messages. Lightning Rod says there is no food shortage yet, only a money shortage. Well, yeah, I think you should be careful with that kind of argument. And we also need to be a little bit cautious about the debasing of the currency, which is going on at the moment. At the end of the day, right, what matters is real physical and ecological constraints. And the economy should serve us and serve the planet rather than the other way around. We shouldn't make the economy into a kind of a god in the way that perhaps we have done in recent years. But if you say there's only a money shortage, I think that can be misleading, because that makes one think that actually it's really in the economy and in finance that the changes are needed, not in the real world. But it's both. It has to be both. Okay, what else we got? Vanya says, thank you for talking to us all, Rupert, and giving us focus. It's much appreciated. Love and rage. Thank you very much, Vanya. And Helen says, your speed is spot on. Oh, well, okay. I won't slow down much more then. What else we got here? Yeah. With every threat, there is an opportunity, says David McConnell. There is a threat of corporate strengthening as an impoverished state loses power. How can we make sure as much good comes from this terrible time? I couldn't agree with you more. There'll probably be an article in the Daily Mail tomorrow attacking me for saying that the corona crisis is an opportunity as well as a crisis. But I mean, that's just obvious, right? It's really it's politics 101. It's what Rahm Emanuel famously said in the White House a decade or so ago now, during the financial crisis. It goes back originally to things that Winston Churchill said around the latter part of the Second World War. If you have a crisis and you waste it, if your house burns down and you rebuild it unthinkingly in the same way, well, you're just an idiot. If you set yourself up for more reoccurrences of the same crisis as you emerge from one crisis, you're just an idiot. So it's very, very clear that with every threat there is an opportunity. How can we make sure as much good comes from this terrible time? I think we have to experience it. I think we have to learn the lessons, and we have to get serious about drawing to the attention of people who just want to go back to how things were before, go back to normal. What was wrong with that normal? And what was wrong with that normal was that it made us vulnerable to pandemics. What was wrong with it was that it made us vulnerable to the climate and ecological emergency. What was wrong with it also was that it left a lot of people systematically vulnerable, economically vulnerable, in ways that we're now seeing more of. So there's a good argument for saying, look, wouldn't it be better to have a society where there weren't so many people on the breadline and with no food in the cupboards as they went into some kind of potential crisis? In other words, it's a kind of call for fairness and love. And when you see, for example, the way that some countries are right now nationalizing their private health industries, I think that's quite significant. And that shows that in some sense, some deep level, we know that it's wrong to commodify healthcare. And in an emergency, it would be just plain wrong for some people to buy their way out of the vulnerability that we face together. So we need to be making those arguments strongly, and we need to be making it very uncomfortable for anyone who, like Cummings or Trump, says things along the lines of, well, actually, maybe a few old people's lives don't really matter that much compared to the economy. Okay. What else we got here? Sarah Edgerton says, UBI is the only way forward. Why is there no discussion about a new model for how we live? Well, but I think there is. I think it's coming. I think it's very much out there. One place I'd recommend you should look, Sarah, is on The Conversation. The Conversation is a website where academics share their ideas and research for general public consumption, and there's some very good stuff on there suggesting, in outline, new models for how we should live. I've had stuff on there in the past. It's a really useful site. I agree with you, as I implied earlier, that UBI is at least a very good option for right now. There are other possibilities. One other possibility would be UBS, which is Universal Basic Services, plus food rationing. So I wouldn't quite agree with you that UBI is the only way forward, but it's certainly better than what the government have managed to come up with so far. Kenny says, I highly recommend Common Sense in the 21st Century by Roger Hallam for those concerned with what to do when we come through this. And yeah, I would echo that. Roger is a brilliant thinker, colleague of mine, key strategist in Extinction Rebellion. Sometimes a little bit loose in the way that he speaks, but none of us are perfect. And Roger's book is very useful. If you're interested in my responses to it, there's my little pamphlet called Truth and Its Consequences, and also the pamphlet I wrote earlier this year called Rushing the Emergency, Rushing the Rebellion. And those are both responses to Roger's work. In terms of guidance for what to do when we come through this, though, I do want to reiterate the point I made earlier, that we are in a new situation here, and we have to be responsive to that newness, and that if we're not, we'll be in serious trouble. We will be left behind by the tide of change. We are almost out of time, folks. I've got time for one more question here, because we have to end by 7:30. So what shall I do as a final question here? How about this from Gwyn? Shall we try to combat the individualist narrative of pandemic response? I feel people are policing each other's behavior in a way that is inefficient and confusing. That's very interesting. It takes me back to where I started with this video that I've done, which has gone viral, as they say. It's a slightly unfortunate turn of phrase, perhaps. The government, I believe, in this country, in the UK, is encouraging us to have a solely individualistic response or household-based response to the crisis. And that they're doing that because they're abdicating their responsibility. And I think when the death toll mounts, as it now will, there will be enormous anger against the government. And I hope that we'll be there to channel some of that anger, because we need to be. And I hope that you'll all participate in that in one way or another. It's wrong to blame individuals for what is essentially a matter for collectives, communities, nations to decide. Yeah, that's where we're at in this solemn matter. Any emergency goes way, way beyond what should be and can be left up to individuals to police or decide. We are out of time. Thank you so much for all your questions and comments. I apologize to those of you I didn't get to. Apologize also for the technical fault in the middle. Both these two bits of the live stream will be available to watch afterwards. So do watch them if you want to catch up what you missed, or share them with people and so on. And yeah, I really appreciate you being here this morning. I look forward to doing this again in this new world that we're living in. Thanks very much for your time, and yeah, stay strong and stay safe. Let's stay safe together. Thank you. Good night.